Welcome to the American Academy of Grief Counseling's Videogram on grief modules. And in this video, we're going to look at some of the more popular grief theories of the last 50 years and analyze them in more detail. The flow of grief, though, for the longest time in the early days, especially early 19th century, turn of the 20th century, the Freudian view was held that grief is an unnatural balance. It was a state of being that needed to be rebalanced to find good mental health again. But what we've learned and really always have known is that grief actually is just a natural reaction to a loss, as natural as any other emotion that we have. There's nothing mentally wrong with it. So with that being said, grief in itself is unique. It does have some general guidelines that we can follow with our analyzation of how humans react to loss, but it is still very much unique. So when we analyze various models of grief, we have to be very aware that not one size fits all. Instead, grief is something that is rarely as organized as we like it to be. It's more of like an ebb and flow of the ocean, or even another view, like a set of oscillating emotions that go up and down until some sort of stability is reached. So in this way, as this next slide shows, emotions fluctuate and emotions are very unique. So grief does have phases, but it's not always as neat and as ordered as we wish they were. In fact, our grief work that we have to put into in understanding the loss, in dealing with our emotions, is something that we deal with our whole life. There's truly no recovery in grief. It's just a learning to live with the grief and so forth. Of course, the most famous of all grief models was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She dealt with the dying and the phases that they exhibited, namely denial, anger, bargaining, and then an emotional reaction. Finally, after that acceptance, came to a period of time when they accepted the fact that death was there. The emotion had been let out, the bargaining, the anger, and denial had all gone through. Now, this is not, again, a one-size-fits-all model, but it does help us have some understanding of human reaction to bad news, to loss, and so forth. John Bowlby also presented 4 stages of grief. He was a pioneer in attachment theory. Attachment theory is a very important psychological study where he looked at babies, infants in particular, and how they responded to having their mother taken away from them. And this taught a lot about loss, because when we lose something, the value that we place on it, or the attachment we have to what we lose, will also have an effect on our grief reaction. John Bowlby listed shock and numbness, the initial thud of the loss itself. Then he looked at yearning and searching as a second stage that he witnessed. Despair and disorganization is the third element. And then the fourth was reorganization and eventual recovery. So in many ways, it does share resemblances to Kubler-Ross's model. The shock and numbness is sort of like a denial. The yearning and searching has a lot to do with maybe the anger and the emotion that goes with it. The despair and the disorganization goes with the bargaining and the emotional distraught, and the reorganization and recovery resembles the acceptance stage. J. William Worden also had 4 tasks of mourning that he felt were extremely important for anyone who experienced a loss. The first step that Worden listed was to accept the reality of the loss itself. And this sometimes takes a little bit of time, after the denial and so forth. Sometimes that reality isn't fully comprehended until the funeral itself. The second task that he listed was processing the pain of grief and working your way through it, which can take months. So this is a second phase or a second task that isn't as easy as it is written. And then the third task that he listed was to adjust to the world without the deceased. And this can take years. You have death anniversaries and so forth. You have holidays, and you experience those days without your loved one. And then the final task that Ward enlisted was to find a connection with the deceased while beginning a new life. And this is where we start to see commemoration of the deceased, where a holiday comes around and you miss the deceased, but you're able to smile back at some of the memories, maybe commemorate, have a picture of the deceased and so forth. But while remembering, still moving forward and experiencing new things in life, even though it's still painful not to have the loved one anymore. Therese Rondo also had a list of things that the bereaved go through, and she has her 6 R's, which is another classic model. And again, you're going to see that it kind of resembles the previous 3. To recognize the loss, to react to the loss, to recollect and re-experience the loss. Now, this is an important part where you actually go back and analyze the situation. You've reacted to it. Now you're consciously thinking about the loss and understanding it. Relinquishing the loss, meaning I'm going to now accept it and begin to move forward. To readjust from the loss. And isn't that the biggest thing in grief recovery? Readjustment, finding new patterns, new things to do that you didn't do before the loss itself. And then reinvesting after the loss. And this means creating new friendships, making new bonds and so forth. Again, it doesn't involve letting complete go of the individual, replacing the individual. That's definitely not one of the R's in this, but it is more of a reinvestment into the future while still cherishing the individual that was lost. Robert Nehmeyer also in recent years has done a lot of work in what we call meaning reconstruction. And he teaches that grief is not simply a series of phases, but is an oscillating series of emotions. And that's everything that we've been saying so far. It's not that Nehmeyer is dismissing the phases. He's just more pointing out that it's more than just step 1, step 2, step 3. And if you have that attitude or that belief, then you really don't understand grief itself, because individuals go back and forth. They reverse, they go forward. They feel good one day, they might feel bad the next. There's no rhyme or reason why an individual is not getting over something quicker than maybe somebody else, because as I said, grief is unique, but it is also very emotional. We can, like I said before as well, have a universal system that we apply to individuals who grieve, but it has to be taken with a grain of salt in some respects too, because individuals are completely different. And that's mainly what Nehmeyer is pointing out, that we just can't limit it to phases, but we have to see that it is a much more unique and emotional thing itself. Nehmeyer lists that the meaning of the death needs to be understood, and what that death means to the person's past, present, and future. And then how to move forward, making connections in a positive way as you move forward with life, while at the same time realizing that you still lost someone you loved, but you understand how that loss is related to your theme of life. And this is where we recreate the loss in one's life narrative going forward. So if you think of it as a book about you, your own autobiography, so to speak, your chapter 1, you're born, and so forth. Some chapters aren't very pleasant. especially with a loss of a loved one. And in that chapter, we have to understand, what is that chapter in the overall book of our life, the story of our life, and how are we to process that loss in relationship to the previous chapters, but also to the present and the future chapters. And like all books, every chapter is important. So as we move forward and have new chapters that might be very happy, we still recall that one chapter that was sad, and we understand that chapter is very important to us. We cherish that chapter of our life, and we also understand that chapter of our life makes us who we are as we move forward. So that's pretty much what meaning reconstruction is about. If you would like to review our grief counseling certification program, here we have a link to our page itself with more information, as well as a request for information page. If you would like to contact AIHCP, you may do so by phone at 330-652-7776. Again, that's 330-652-7776. You can also email us at info@aihcp.org. Again, that's info@aihcp.org. I guess from all of this, I just want you to understand that the models of grief are very important. They do point to particular steps or phases within an individual's grief recovery process to eventual adjustment. They have different ways of expressing it with maybe different emphasis on them. But the most important thing to do is to remember is that it is not the only thing, phases and steps, but it is also a series of emotions that are difficult to sort through, and a series of oscillations that lead to extreme happiness, to extreme sadness, and so forth. And no one is the same in this recovery process in itself. People experience grief differently and uniquely in that regard. So not all fit all, but we can have a general idea of how the human species reacts to loss. We have to adapt it to the individual as well. I'd like to thank you for listening today, and have a great day.